old friends and some new familiar faces. So thanks all for being here, and we'll begin. So for those who don't know, I'm Glenn Poole, CEO of the Australian Men's Health Forum, and I'd like to welcome you all to this session of Men's Health Connected today, which is part of our series on male suicide prevention. So before I start formally, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're meeting on today from around Australia. For me, it's the traditional lands of the Belai, the Gureng, the Garangarang and the Tarbalang Bunda nations. And if you want to acknowledge the lands that you're on and want to pop it in the chat box, you're very welcome to do so. So today's session is part of an unfolding campaign we're running called the Time to Act on Male Suicide campaign. We hope over time to develop strands of this campaign in every state and territory of the country and federally as well. We piloted this campaign last year in Tasmania. Great to see that Jonathan Bedlow from Men's Resources Tasmania is with us today. And I may call on you, Jonathan, at some point if you're around for the whole session to provide some insight into the campaign down there. What we're trying to do is roll out the campaign at times when the relevant governments are actually thinking about their suicide prevention strategy. Victoria has been going through a process of renewing its suicide prevention and response strategy. We have engaged with the Department of Health there and been part of focus groups focused on male suicide. But we also want to bring a bit more awareness and provide resources that people can use at a political level. Because our experience is that that men all too often, even in a space like suicide prevention, where 3 in 4 suicides are men, men all too often fall off the agenda far too quickly. And the more pressure and more light we can shine on the issue for as many different angles as possible, the more likely men are to be targeted in suicide prevention strategies. So Kim, at some point, if you're still with us, I'd be grateful if you could drop the link to the campaign on our website into the chat box. One thing you can all do is sign up to the campaign on our website if you haven't already, and there's plenty of resources on there you can download. The key one being a short and snappy report making the case for a suicide prevention action plan focused on men in Victoria. And I'm going to share with you some slides which highlight the key points from that report. So bear with me whilst I click the right buttons. And are you all seeing my screen? Excellent. Would help if I actually had it at the beginning, wouldn't it? There we go. See, I'm out of practice. Right, slide 1. Time to act on male suicide in Victoria. Okay, so if I could just work out, there we go, fantastic. So much of this will be very familiar to all of you. As in the rest of the country, suicide in Victoria is the leading killer of men under 55 years of age. That's one of the many reasons why it's a key issue we should be concerned with. In terms of Victoria specifically, more than 3 in 4 suicides are male. Suicide kills more than 10 men a week. I think it's actually up to 11 a week now, and the actual number of suicides, to be precise, rather than the rate of suicide, but the number of suicides has increased by about 40% in the last 10 years. That's the number of male suicides. So not only is it an issue as a leading killer, it's also an issue that's not reducing at a time when many other sort of leading causes of death are on the decline. Things like heart disease we see declining. So broadly speaking, one of the problems here is that while 3 in 4 suicides are men, up to 4 in 5 beneficiaries of programs that are funded to prevent suicide are women. These aren't generally programs that are female suicide prevention programs. They're not directed specifically at women, but they're directed at interventions which we would describe as being more female friendly, more focused on issues that women face, or focused on ways of providing support which are more appropriate and useful to women. So there's a big gap there. And the way we know this is because we repeatedly over the last 5 to 6 years have wherever possible analysed where funding goes. The most recent time we were able to do this in Victoria was shortly prior to the last election last year, when the federal and state government had a bilateral agreement. This is available publicly, you can go and check it out, and identified $800 million of funding, which was specifically directed at mental health and suicide prevention. Not only does this funding all support initiatives that will clearly reach more women than men, based on the past record of all of these services, but there was a mention of 4 specific priority populations, and men weren't identified as a priority population. So time and time again, what we're seeing as an issue at a political and policy level is that governments keep directing more funding towards initiatives that are effective at reaching women than men, and then we keep getting the result that more men die of suicide than women. There's no proof that putting more funding into male suicide prevention would actually reduce the number of male suicides, but we would argue that it's until you've tried it, you can't disprove it. So why not target more funding specifically at initiatives that are designed to reach more men? And people get really uncomfortable about this point, but we think the light needs to be shone on it. And why people get uncomfortable about it, one of the reasons is that it sounds like we're creating a men versus women war, and we're not. We are not arguing ever for any of the funding that's already been directed to services that are really good at reaching women to be taken away. We're not saying that women have got it all or got enough. There are still many women killing themselves, and more needs to be done for female suicide prevention. What we're saying is that governments need to actually take into account where they're directing their funding, and if they find that if they think about it and find that the majority of the funding they're directing at suicide prevention is going to reach women, because this is predictable, nearly in every single case it's predictable, then there's a couple of things that they can do. One is that they can actually work with those providers and say, look, there's another round of funding coming, but this time you've got to start showing that you're using some of that funding to get more effective at reaching men. We want to see the proportion of men you're reaching going up. And the other is that they can identify other areas of funding or programs which they know from the start are more likely to reach men. So they could be projects that are specifically targeted at men, or projects that are targeted in ways that they're guaranteed to reach more men. So like, a suicide prevention program targeted into the construction industry might reach 85% men and 15% women. So it's not just about targeting funding initiatives that only target men, but it's thinking about how can we direct funding in ways that is bound to reach more men and create more of a balance in the way that we fund suicide prevention services. And actually, when you sort of take the public through these issues, which we did 2 years ago, we did a national survey of over 1,000 people, which was representative of the Australian population and could get broken down into states and territories. We found that when you talk people through this issue, both men and women will say that, yeah, we recognize that men and women face different social issues. We think it's okay for governments to talk about the issues that men face as well as the issues that women face. There appears to be differences between men and women, and we shouldn't ignore those differences. And we would support additional funding to tackle men's health issues. And again, the public does not broadly support the idea of giving more to one gender than the other, doesn't even generally support the idea of 50-50, has quite a nuanced view and thinks, yes, there should be funding for men and there should be funding for women, and it should be proportionate to need. It should be directed where it's most needed. And when we ask people, what issues do you think are most important to address in terms of men's health and social well-being, the top 2 that Victorians say is mental health and male suicide. So there's clear support at a public level to put more funding towards men's issues. And it's important as well to think in this way, in a gender responsive way for suicide prevention, because there's some really key ways that male suicide and female suicide differ. Male suicide more commonly linked to a whole range of sort of situational factors. This is Victorian data, but these patterns are reflected right across Australia. So most suicides linked to relationship breakdown, a physical illness, drug problems, being in trouble with the police, a range of situational factors, things to do with work, money, job loss, all more likely to be associated with male suicide, whereas suicides linked to a mental health diagnosis and a previous suicide attempt far more likely to be associated with female suicide. So there's differences that we already know from the data we have, which can help us target services in more gender responsive ways, which can benefit our efforts to prevent both male suicide and female suicide. And one of the key things we're keen to do is really challenge the narrative that the reason we have the male suicide problem is that men don't get help. We've been digging around. We've known for a long time that that narrative is unhelpful, to say the least. It's stigmatizing, as many men do get help, and it's often based on the assumption that the help that men need is counselling and psychological support, and so it's often measured on how much men reach out for that type of support. There's a great bit of we're getting lots of data now from coroners, from different surveys, which is showing that the vast majority of men who suicide will have been in contact with some type of service. And one of the most interesting pieces of research is in this area comes out of Victoria, where there was an analysis of the Victorian Suicide Register, which looked at all suicides over 2 or 3 years and looked at categorizing them into different types of suicide. One group, about 50%, were suicides linked with an actual mental health diagnosis. And this was the most interesting one. It was more men than women, but slightly higher portion than women than you would get generally. So I can't remember the exact figures, but let's say if it was 75-25 normally for suicide, that maybe this was more 70-30, but still a very large chunk of men. 90% of those people with a mental health diagnosis who died by suicide, 90% had been in contact with mental health services. And that broadly represented half of all suicides in Victoria, and the majority of those were men. So it's just simply false to say that those men died because they didn't access help. We don't know what happened on an individual level, but clearly those men were in the mental health system. Now, not surprisingly, when you look at suicides that are more commonly linked with situational factors like relationship issues, money issues, those types of things, men are less likely to be in mental health treatment because they don't have a mental health diagnosis. But even then, around a third of those whose suicides were mostly linked with situational factors, even a third were in mental health treatment, even though they didn't have a specific mental illness or mental health diagnosis. And more broadly, we find, though this didn't come out in this particular piece of research, because this particular piece of research was looking at engagement with health systems, what we find is where men die and their suicide is predominantly linked with some kind of situational factor, like a relationship issue or trouble with the police or legal problems, money problems, they have almost always been in contact with some type of service. Police service, court services, housing services, Centrelink, community services, and so on and so forth. So the majority of men who die by suicide are in contact with services in some way, a large chunk of them with actual mental health services, many of them with health services more generally, like a GP or emergency department, and many of them in contact with a broader range of public services. So these aren't men not in the system, these are men in the system who are not getting the help and support that they need. So, for those reasons combined, the high rate of male suicide, the increasing rise in male suicide numbers, the disparity in the way that funding is currently being directed, the clear differences between male suicide and female suicide, and the fact that men are showing up in the system but not getting the support they need, all add up to us to make the case for the fact that we say there should actually be some kind of male suicide prevention action plan in Victoria to target men at risk of suicide more effectively. Whether that's a specific standalone strategy or a separate strand within the suicide prevention strategy, but it needs to be more than simply saying men are a priority population and then dedicating no particular funding to that problem, or not going through a commissioning and thinking process to work out how Victoria responds to the fact that the majority of people who die by suicide are men. And we would say that because we advocate for men. We advocate in the area of male suicide. We strongly believe that this should be the case right across Australia at every level of government. But we're not the only people saying it. Suicide Prevention Australia, the peak body for the suicide prevention sector in the country, has identified the need for male suicide to be called out and for there to be action plans and policies directed at it, backed up with funding to be able to deliver those action plans. And also Christine Morgan pulled out some key areas where male suicide needs to be addressed as a priority in her final report to the Prime Minister. For those who don't know, Christine Morgan was the Prime Minister's suicide prevention advisor who provided a report back in 2021. We've already said that, so I don't know why that's there. So final thoughts then in terms of some of the things that could be included in the action plan. This is not a definitive list, it's not a final list, but we do think the Victorian government can play a major role in actually stopping putting the responsibility on solving this on the men who are at risk of suicide. Because when we don't actually make it a systemic problem, we make it an individual problem. We make it a problem of why don't men get help rather than why aren't we better at getting help. And in the process, we reinforce that apparent masculine norm to be strong and go it alone. If we care about gender stereotypes and breaking through gender stereotypes, then one way we can break through the gender stereotype that men should be strong and tough and solve problems on their own is actually to provide support and services that reaches out and attempts to help men. So we've made this point. We need a fully funded suicide prevention action plan, and here are some broad actions we would like to see included. The auditing piece comes from Christine Morgan. She doesn't use the word audit, she uses the word review, but her recommendation was that every state and federal government should review the actions it's already taking to see how male friendly and appropriate they are. We believe that a process of auditing or gender budgeting to actually identify where money's been allocated and how effective it is at reaching men would be really helpful, because it would show up the fact that we already know that most funding is going towards initiatives that are more likely to reach women, and therefore the government would be in a position where it could choose whether to respond to that or not. I think it's really important that men's lived experience is involved. We've had a lot of focus in recent years, which is very welcome, on the importance of the lived experience voice. Often, I would say most of the time, we don't take into account gender within that. So it's really important to ensure that men's lived experience is actually brought to the table, not just lived experience in general. I strongly believe that part of the solution is grassroots projects delivered by men for men. There are already lots of great organizations doing their best on the smell of an oily rag to provide support for men in their communities. We think that needs to be recognized, particularly because there's lots of reasons why we should do that, but one of the reasons is that the suicide prevention and mental health workforce is very female dominated. If we want to make the whole space of mental health and suicide prevention more male friendly, one way is to get more men working in that space. That takes a long time in terms of training and recruitment, but one way we can get more people in the broader suicide prevention workforce is by getting more volunteers and projects run by men for men into the system. Training is very important. Most suicide prevention training is generic, doesn't look at gender. So any training that can help make the health system consider the needs of men is very welcome. Workplace programs, I've already mentioned the idea of programs that work in construction, one way of reaching more men. And particularly for men, we think it can't all be about mental health. We really need initiatives that are responding to the key risk factors that we know put men at greater risk of suicide. Things like relationship breakdown, financial issues, legal issues. So that's it broadly. That's our call to action. We have a couple of requests. I'm going to close this slideshow. I have a couple of requests before I open up the floor. One is that you sign up to the campaign and receive alerts from us. If you're Victoria based, I very much encourage you to take our resources and approach your politicians, your state politicians, your senators, even your federal politicians, if you think it's worthwhile. Make them aware of this issue and see if you can get their support. But also, this report and this campaign is a starting point. It's not an end point. We've done it on our own from a national perspective because sadly we don't actually have a peak body representing men in Victoria. We were very fortunate in Tasmania to be able to work in partnership with Men's Resources Tasmania, which does the job of a peak body in Tasmania representing men, which is one of the reasons why we were pretty successful in getting traction in Tasmania. But we very much would like to work in partnership with organisations working with men based in Victoria, or any organisations working in suicide prevention in Victoria, to put more weight behind the call. And if you think stuff's wide of the mark or there's stuff we should be including, we're really open to that. This is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. But also the time to act is now, because Victoria is going through the process right now of publishing its, developing and publishing its next suicide prevention and response strategy. So that's it from me. I think first I'd just like to give Jonathan Bedlow in Tasmania an opportunity just to share a little bit of the experience of as piloting this campaign in Tasmania before opening the floor, giving a priority to people who are based in Victoria beyond that. Jonathan, sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you're up to it.
That's all right. Yeah, look, I think we did have quite a bit of success down here in terms of, I'll put a link in the chat to an implementation plan, which is sort of the next step after the development of the strategy. In the Tassie strategy, men were named as a priority population. It was a bit weak. We felt it didn't reach, there's no, for me, it means there's no compulsion on services to really think about men in everything they do. But we did have success in that first implementation plan, and they've got quite a lot of strategies and actions that they're going to implement. So it's very exciting. And yeah, I guess I feel that we were actually asked to convene by the State Health Department a bit of a working group or a consultative group of the local men's organisations. And we really feel like that actually made a massive difference, that the people who came from the department really heard the message loud and clear from an experience in the room with those people. So if there's a way to get something like that happening, I'd certainly encourage you in Victoria to do that. Yeah, otherwise, happy to answer any other questions along the way, but there's definitely, I think the point is it is a good point at which action can be taken.
Great, thanks, Jonathan, for that. So I'd like to open the floor, prioritising people based in Victoria or with outlets operate. If you're not based in Victoria, but your group runs in Victoria, I suppose that counts too. But really, any questions, any feedback, anything you want to say you really support, anything you say you think's missing, really open to get some general feedback and conversation from particularly Victorian-based folks. Either jump in or raise a hand. Owen, lots of experience of suicide prevention in Victoria, so love to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, one thing I like that you did with the presentation was to break down the heading that is men, which I think is one of the challenges we have. It's certainly not nuanced enough to really focus on where we need to target, where we need to make our focuses. So certainly things like separated men, men over 55, and men who've experienced significant life events. For me, are particularly areas that we really need to identify as vulnerable populations rather than men as such, because that seems to be, we kind of lose traction, I think, a little bit because we're probably just too broad when we talk about around populations. The other thing that I'm aware of, and I'm not quite clear on some of the data that you got, and I know that we have about 30% of suicides within clinical mental health services that are male, that are of the total population, but that tends to be less gender differentiated because it's more around the chronicity of the illnesses. That tends to be what the pattern is, which kind of suggests a few other things around that maybe in the general population that it's a bit more than 75-25, and that's certainly what we notice in rural areas. That 75-25 split isn't as accurate as the more rural you get. There seems to be more men that suicide. So I think that's certainly a pertinent one. But yeah, I do like the way that you've split things up as far as the vulnerable populations go. Interested to hear what others say.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Owen.
I just really wanted to say that I really appreciate how you've acknowledged that men are seeking help, and that's not the issue here. And as well, I think it was really great how you acknowledged that the responsibility for this change that we as a society have to make, that shouldn't be put on these men who are struggling or on anyone who's in that position. It's, yeah, I think for the rest of us to speak out and to take the ball on this one, I think. So yeah, I think that's really important to acknowledge that when you're already going through such big emotions as these, don't leave people on their own. It's awesome. Thank you.
Right, and do you want to remind us where you're joining from, Trinity? In terms
Sorry,
of
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I am in Victoria. I'm joining from Eastern Health as a consumer peer support worker. So I do have my own lived experience of suicide survival and have also lost a very close friend to suicide as well. So it's a very personal topic for me, but yeah.
Great. Oh, well, thank you, Trinity. I appreciate you bringing your professional and personal experience to the conversation and for that feedback. Owen, because I know you, I just didn't even ask you to introduce yourself. Could you just also retrospectively introduce yourself so people know where you're speaking from?
Yeah. So I've known Glenn for a while. I've been working in suicide prevention in Gippsland around setting up some suicide prevention services. I also have a bit to do with some of the statewide advisory groups with Safe Care Victoria, and Graham and I do a bit with the Department of Health. generally have been trying and working hard at this area for a number of years. So I've gone up many different roads that have netted something or netted nothing. So, and I'll keep doing it.
Good on you, Owen. Great to see you as always. I'm going to give one last shout out to anyone based in Victoria who wants to chip in, and then we'll open up slightly broader. Matt, so Paul, I've got your hand, but I know you're just down the road from me, so not in Victoria. But we will come back to you, Paul. Matt Thompson.
Hello, thank you. I'm also located in Gippsland.
Mm-hmm.
I think sort of areas I found out from past lived experience trying to get help is actually when men sort of go to report they've had DV issues, relationships, it sort of gets sort of, you know, pushed aside, not recognised. I think that's sort of like a contributor to, you know, like suicide and like the behaviours like that. And I've noticed because when I was living in WA and trying to get assistance for myself, there's nothing there. If you do trying to contact the police, you'll find it sort of goes unheard also. So I think, you know, we sort of need to sort of try and discover a bit, you know, like a change of action on that front.
Yeah.
And also if for people, you know, if they were to sort of leave a situation, when whereabouts do men go? You know, there is quite a lot of support for women, financially at the shelters, but you know, from my own research, I can't find one place that is, you know, situated just for men. And also, I think, you know, just when you do sort of go to seek assistance, it's not taken seriously. You know, I've, again, from lived experience, when I was living in rural WA towards Kalgoorlie, I took myself to hospital nearly 8 years ago, and sort of that service, you know, you have to find the funds to go to a major city. Once you get to the major city, you got to go through the process of, you know, getting onto a board to see if you can be taken in. Mm-hmm. And during that process, the board actually said, whereabouts you're from. And then when I mentioned that I was from originally from Victoria, they said, oh, we can't take you in because of the legislation and different rules. So I think when you know, in that sort of state, that's, you know, the last thing you want to hear. So I'm not quite sure how that works and what's changed. So I do think that that's another sort of area that, you know, probably need to focus on as well.
Yeah, and so then there's an interest. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so. Is it Matt or Matthew?
Yeah, the one, Matthew.
Okay, Matthew. So look, thank you for coming on and sharing your experience so freely. I'm really pleased you feel able to do that. So the interesting sort of then next level question then becomes, well, where do we best address that from? Is there just one solution? Not just looking at you, but then looking at, you know, assuming there's, you know, for every man who tells a story like that, there's another 100,000, 10,000 men having a similar experiences whose story is not being shared here. So where do we go to address that? Is it to make clinicians more aware of that? Is it to ensure that stories like yours are actually heard by the system, so the system can take them to an account? That's the sort of lived experience piece. Is it about actually making the sort of courts or police services more responsive, or is it about having, you know, more organizations run by men, for men, that can support blokes like you, you know, hear your story, believe you, or advocate for you if that's needed? If you were to pick, you know, one, what's the kind of change you would like to see that would mean someone like you might get a better help and support tomorrow or next week or next month?
I think the media is probably the first one. It seems to be quite a big presence that, you know, demonises men at the moment with, you know, DV, men's issues just not getting taken seriously. So I think if we were to get attention and get these issues out there, I'd be focusing on the media. If we're going to get those people's stories, you need a large sort of audience, and then I think we can start sort of work through the arts and the music, because I think a lot of like music is a sort of an aid that helps people with mental health issues. So you could appeal to sort of the artists, so they get those stories out there. And then eventually get like a few ads on TV, so look,
Right, Matthew, thanks for your input. And I think the final point I take from that is the need to sort of shift the broader sort of cultural public conversation about men and the challenges they face. So thanks for that contribution. Really value it. So just so you know, John Rich, I saw your hand was up a minute ago. Ross Dean, I saw your hand was up a minute ago. Paul, I'm keeping you waiting, but I'm just going to jump to Graham because I know he's sort of got that lived experience perspective. I know, so is Victoria based, or you were last time we spoke, Graham. So
yes, I'm well and truly Victorian based. I wear a number of hats in the suicide prevention area. I'm on the board of Suicide Prevention Australia. I'm also on the advisory board of the National Suicide Prevention Office, but in Victoria, I'm co-chair of the Suicide Prevention and Response Expert Advisory Group. There's different terms for all of them. I'd just like to make a point of one of the missing links in the discussion of men, and also the missing links in suicide prevention, is suicide attempt survivors and the surface of aftercare. Aftercare is now in the throes of having a major review through the national agreement, and Victoria should play an active role, as should all other states, to make sure we get a fit for purpose universal aftercare system. Currently, it is, to be polite, all over the shop.
okay, Graham, thanks for that contribution. Appreciate that. So and thanks for being here, Graham. Really appreciate you giving your time when I know you've got many different panels and boards and conversations to be part of. So we're going to go beyond the boundaries of Victoria. Paul, you've been waiting patiently, so I'll come to you first. And Ross and Dean and John Rich, if you still got something to say, please just make yourself known. Paul Klotz.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Just some observations and a point of clarification. What Graham said, I totally agree with. The lack of aftercare is beyond a joke. I mean, I'm a survivor on more than a dozen occasions of needing to exit this world, and my experiences have been woeful at times. I knew what I needed to say to get out of the mental ward because they weren't doing anything for me, and I ended up back living on the streets again. So the holistic approach of just not focusing on the mental aspect, but looking at the emotional, the social, physical, spiritual, financial aspects, they're all key factors as to what may allow that person to turn their life around. In terms of DV, it's one that frustrates me. I'll probably upset people, so I'll apologise up front. DV is a very serious factor within our society, but we also forget that most of the attention is placed on to the female side. 1/3 of males are actually at the receiving end of DV, and yet when we look at all the work that's done, and I serve on a board for a local community organisation that focuses on DV, and I'm struggling to get them to actually start putting some programs in place to help men that are the perpetrators. We can't just stick our head in the sand. We need to be working with these men to understand what's driving them to that point. But yet it just seems to be ignored out there, and we just keep throwing money at the, trying to help the females, which I don't have a problem with, but it's the after fact. We need to go to the cause to actually turn it around. The point of clarification, which is where I first started, was I just needed clarification, Glenn. Was it 9 out of 10 of men that had ended their life had sought some intervention, some
Broadly speaking,
mental health.
those who got those who have a mental health issue, so had a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, which was around about half of all male suicides, close to 40 to 50%. 9 in 10 were actually in mental health treatment. And then we have other data more broadly that often shows that 9 in 10 number, but in different ways. So 9 in 10 might have been in contact with some kind of community service, for example. Sometimes we don't exactly know what the nature of the engagement was.
No, but
then yesterday, I was just to finish. Sorry, Paul. Yesterday, I was looking at a report from Queensland, which links to your point, which was about suicides linked to domestic violence, and men who had, and this was predominantly male perpetrators, men who had a history of domestic violence who then suicided. Again, over 9 out of 10 had been in contact with the police. So this 9 out of 10 figure keeps coming up over and over again. It's different. It's not that 9 out of every 10 men have gone and said, I am suicidal, I need help. The point is that they are engaged in the system. And so what we need to change is the conversation which says men aren't reaching out to the system because men are in the system. It's just that the system isn't always responding directly. Some of those will be men are actually in the system for mental health treatment and suicide ideation, and clearly not getting the quality of help they need. Some are others who are just in the system with a problem, with a chaotic life, and it's not getting picked up that they're a risk for suicide. And I think, perpetrators are probably a prime example, because the engagement is not, are you at risk of suicide? The engagement, if there is engagement, is how can we address your offending behavior, which of course is something, clearly there's a good reason to do that. But if it's not addressing, if that support isn't holistic, it's not picking up the fact that this man's got a whole world of other issues that are going on that may need to be addressed as well, including he may be at very high risk of suicide.
So that 9 out of 10 that you've clarified me is a massive red flag. I mean, for so long, the pushback is that we've struggled to get men to come to the front door. But what it's now saying is we've actually got men not only coming to the front door, but actually going through the front door. But the conversations that we're having with them are obviously not the right conversations.
Correct.
So, and that to me is a huge red flag, and that goes right across, whether it's your GP, whether it's a counsellor, a mentor, or whatever it is. We've got a bigger problem than we thought we had, because most of the correspondence I read and see is that we've just got to get men to talk. I think we are getting men to talk, but we're either not listened to or the right conversations aren't being had. Correct. That's very scary, because we don't want men to go back into their caves.
No, indeed, and there's plenty of evidence to show that if a man's first engagement with the system is a negative one, he's not listened to, he's wrongly he's wrongly diagnosed, or he's given a negative response, dismissed as an angry man, sent to an anger, told he needs to go to an anger management course rather than whatever. We've all heard different stories of negative experiences men have with different service providers. If that first interaction is negative, there's a good chance he won't go back a second time. So there's a lot to be done in improving the service we provide to men, not just in mental health systems or even in health systems, but across a whole range of social and community and other public services.
Yeah.
Paul, thanks for sharing your personal experience. Always strikes me just how many people who want to take part in these conversations bring their own personal experience to the conversation. Ross, you did have your hand up earlier on, and if you still want to contribute. Thanks, Ross. I want to say hello and where you're from, and share what you want to share.
I'm from Casterton. I've been here for 4 years. I'm an ex-principal, and I want to speak from that perspective. The foundations of who we become as men have been unfolded during the school years. And on that basis, I want to share with everybody, and I'm so glad there is so many people here, but there is an organization in the US called the Search Institute, and they have developed a magnificent tool called the Developmental Framework. And it's about building relationships. How do we build great relationships with young people? And it strengthens those people's development. And I've tried to encourage schools and communities and football clubs, etc., to engage in it. It's summarized in a one page. It's brilliant. And it basically shows you how to build great relationships with your own children. And yeah, it's wonderful. And so the other thing I would mention too, the huge amount of resources that are available worldwide, and you know, the fact that the Tasmanians are here and the wonderful work that they've done in the last couple of years is online, and you can access their documents and what they've been doing. But I'd also mention to you today, somehow I have downloaded a 500-page PDF from America, and I've been looking at it, and it's brilliant. It's called Reducing Suicide, a National Imperative. And it is first class, but it's amongst, there are so many things, you know, organisations like Standby, and you know, there's just so much good stuff going on. And yeah, it's, and
right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate your contribution. Good to see you again. I've tried to, in the background, search out those assets you've referenced and paste them in the chat box. Tony Webb.
Yeah, I'm from North Melbourne, but I've been in various parts of the country. To build on the comments from Paul and Ross, there's a lot of focus on how we approach the problem of suicide from a structural and an organisational point of view. And I think what the two previous speakers have touched on, it's the quality of the relationships that are built that is so critical. And just to look at it in terms of the professionalisation of dealing with suicide, we've got some major problems at the moment in terms of how these issues are dealt with. Just to take example from the area of trauma, we now are getting the evidence that the so-called evidence-based approach to dealing with people with trauma is failing in 30 to 70% of the cases. So-called best practice is failing to actually touch these guys, and many of these guys are also the ones who will then go on to self-harm in some way, either via alcohol, various sorts of addictions, or in terms of suiciding. We now know that the standard treatments for depression that the GPs hand out are similarly failing in about half of the cases. So that what we've got to really look at is how do we provide the kind of support for men that works for them. And my experience of working within men's groups is that the moment a guy touches on some aspect of suicide ideation, in a good group, he will find that at least half of the guys in that room are there with him with similar experiences. And that being able to feel that I'm not alone, that there are people who do understand because they've been there and in this case haven't done it, is often a big step towards being able to help them to heal. The other one is simply to have within those networks of men the basic training for first aid in terms of suicide prevention. We train all the guys through the Sheds networks in the PQR approach. Question, persuade, refer. What are you talking about? Are you serious about this idea of self-harm? Tell me about it. Draw it out in terms of that. Then approach directly in terms of saying, we are asking you not to do that. We're going to here to persuade you that that's not going to be the solution to your problem. It's going to affect a whole load of people, including us, if you were to do it. And then to have within that, those men's groups, the network of places we can refer to that are going to deal with this in a male sympathetic fashion.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of the guts of what we're needing in terms of this stuff. The services that carry that, yes, we've got to look at those, but it's a question of what they are carrying into this work that's critical.
Great. Thanks, Tony. You covered a great deal of information there. I'm only going to pull out one point, which is the gatekeeper training, QPR, or any other form of gatekeeper training. One of the things we know that there's quite a lot of funding gone into gatekeeper training in recent years, but whenever I see an analysis of who's received that training, 70% of people receiving the training are women. So again, it's another area where we're not reaching out to men. And so if we want to build resilience within men as a group, we need to name that as a problem and say, yeah, gatekeeper training is great. Let's get more people doing it, but let's actively get more men doing it, because the fact is, we're doing a piece of work on men's social connection at the moment. The fact is, when we look at our closest connections, more men have men as best mates and more women have women as best mates. So if you want to reach men, one of the routes is through other men. And so building resilience within men as a community, so that you know, every group of men is a men's group, essentially, is a part of our challenge. But thanks for your contribution, Tony. Jeff Lawrence, lovely to see you. The floor is yours.
Good to see you again. I want to lead with my chin. As Glenn knows, I'm quite strongly involved in the church. And what I'd like to hear from the men's health community, particularly those in male suicide prevention, well, I don't think the churches provide a good, safe place for men who are thinking of suicide or have attempted or the like. And leaving aside some churches' default position, well, we'll preach religion at them. What I would like to get some input from people is, what can we in the church community do to provide a safe space or to be one of those places where men who are thinking of it or have survived from it or these issues would think that'd be a safe place to go to. And equally, I guess, apart from trying to ram religion down their throats, what are some of the things we're doing that are an impediment? You don't have to answer all those now, but if someone wants to respond to that, Glenn, you're free to give them my email address, because I just think it's a space where we in the church community need to be part of the solution. And if not part of the solution, at least a place where guys can find refuge and know they're not alone. Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for championing your community as a potential resource. I know that you personally do great work for the men in your network, so we need more. We need more folk like you. I'm interested to hear from. We're going to wrap up very shortly, but I'm seeing some. I've got a hand there. I've seen you, Robert. Just give me a second. There's a couple of names in the room that we haven't heard from, and I would love to hear from if they want to contribute. Love to hear from you, from Matt. I think you're Wesley Life Force, and I'd certainly love to hear from you, Robert. And if anyone else wants to say anything, this is pretty much your last chance in this round. And I see people have been very active in the chat box as well. Thank you, Andrew, for all your great comments. But I'm going to come to Robert. We've not heard from you today, so I'd love to hear from you. You could let us know who you are and where you're from, and the floor is yours.
Me? Oh, sorry. Yeah. I thought someone else was going to go before me. Yeah, no, quickly. I mean, there's I've got a lot to say, but I don't want to say too much and don't take too long. But I've had a personal, pretty close experience to actually committing suicide. Just going back a little bit without too much. I was in a state of depression. I didn't actually realize until I come out of it. This is going back a few years. And then like, I didn't realize how depressed I was, and I was suicidal on a number of occasions. But then when I was separated and I ended up in Melbourne, and I'm cutting a whole lot of stuff out of the story, believe me. And I was over there for rehearsals. I do music, and I was on either the 22nd or something floor of a hotel suite, I wasn't in a very good place, and I considered going over the balcony on a couple of occasions. And talking about a faith, God brought to me my family, my friends and relatives, and also the thought about the people on the footpath. And this went through my mind a couple of times, and so I ended up having to close lock the door. With the blind trial, I shared it with the director of the opera, and I took a few days off. But and I'm still, I can't look at balconies or when I go and stay in hotels, I stay on the lower floor. You know what I mean? But I think what we've got to look at is like community. It's not, we can't just rely on governments and departments and all this sort of stuff, but communities and friends and families and people who know you, to look for behavior patterns and stuff like that there. And men need to be more respected and loved within communities, within their schools and stuff. And there's a lot sort of like that deteriorates that, and that makes them feel good about themselves. And therefore, and also, connecting up with men's groups and be able to share with men. And we need more men to be able to saying stuff to men. So anyway, that's about it, thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you, Robert. And again, appreciate you sharing your own experience so honestly and frankly.
And just before we go on,
Andrew.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Could I offer people the chance to have a look at a case study that I did, which is fairly typical of the way I've worked with men at risk for 30 years. And it's a case study just from a couple of years ago of pulling a man back from the brink. It's only a couple of pages. I'll forward it to Glenn if people want to have a read of it. You can see how social work can work to reduce men at risk.
Great, thank you. Thanks for all you do to advocate for better support for men in the social work profession. I wish we had more of you. Thanks to Kieran for sharing his perspective there from the Army perspective and veteran perspective. There's so many great comments in this chat box. I'm going to have to take an hour to read all of these afterwards. We're going to have to wrap up. So look, next steps, we are going to be rolling this campaign out over the next couple of weeks. We'll actually be launching our national campaign next week at the National Suicide Prevention Conference. But if you want to keep track of this particular campaign in Victoria, make sure you sign up via the link I've posted in the chat box. We'll be making sure that all key politicians in Victoria get a copy of the report, and we'll be seeing if we can raise the profile of this conversation and push it a little bit further up the agenda in Victoria. Thanks for all you've contributed today. Please stay in touch. Keep following what we're up to. Come and contribute and share with your networks. It's been a great conversation. And I'm going to go off now and read all these messages in the chat box. Thanks for your time.